Council, that leads us into our last delegation of the evening, which is from our president at the Six Nations Development Corporation, Matt Jamieson, in relation to the Lake Erie Connector project. Is Matt on the line? Sorry, Shirley, if you can just confirm. Everybody doesn't have to jump at once. Shirley, if you could just confirm if Matt is in the waiting room. Okay, I see him connecting now. Thank you for that, Shirley. Appreciate that. Good evening and welcome to General Counsel, Matt. We have you next on our delegation. With that being said, I know there's obviously the necessary documents within your Dropbox, so I'm going to pass the floor right over to yourself, Matt, to walk us through this portion of the delegation. Oh, sorry, I did see him on the line. Maybe he was having some connectivity issues. There he is connecting to audio again. Apologies to our community. Okay, there he is. Good evening, Matt.
Hi, good evening. Sorry about that. I'm having technical difficulties here.
Yeah, no problem, Matt. I'm just going to pass the floor right over to yourself to walk us through the next item.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure the council has the briefing note along with the package of materials that we had sent last week. So the agenda item is the Lake Erie Connector project, which is something that has been circling our community for many, many years. And so essentially, just as a bit of a backgrounder, I know the council is aware of this. In October of 2021, so last fall, we came to the council to seek a renewed mandate to explore the Lake Erie Power Connector project to see what was in fact the opportunity for our community to participate. And at that time, council had given us a mandate to go and work with a company called ITC, who is the developer of the Lake Erie Power Connector. And effectively, over the last several months since October, we have been working with ITC to flesh out what those options would be for the community. So, you know, the briefing note really speaks to this in great detail. And essentially what we're here tonight for is to update the council and to seek approval from the council to proceed with entering into a term sheet, which would allow the project to be shared with the community through a community investment review process, which is outlined in the briefing note. So I know last year there was a number of discussions with the council, and I think there's a lot of sensitivity around how do we effectively, you know, reach out to the community for these types of projects. I also know that there's lots of work to be done, and I know the council has it on their agenda to look at ways in which we can enhance community consultation opportunities into the future. This project, the ITC Lake Erie Connector, is in fact time constrained. And so what we've done is we've put together a work plan, if you will, that includes our due diligence that would run in tandem with a community consultation piece. And so as part of that due diligence, we have already had our legal counsel review the term sheet, which is presented in the package. We have engaged an environmental consulting firm called Megan Burnside, who are an Indigenous-owned environmental consulting company who are professionals in that space. We have engaged Dillon Consulting to draft and develop the community consultation piece that we'll use for the investment review. That summary is also included in the package. And we have also engaged a financial advisor, First Canadian Property Investments, to do a preliminary assessment of the project economics associated with Six Nations participation in the project. All of that work is being done to equip us, the council, the community, with the with the requisite information to make a decision on whether or not we want to participate in this project. Essentially, the term sheet sets out really three choices for the community, for the council moving forward. The first choice is to participate in the project as an equity owner. And equity means that we would be an investor and an owner of 7.5% of the transmission line. The other option is through a participation payment, which is very much like a royalty payment, where we receive an annual royalty stipend, and the project, continues to operate as a going concern without our ownership. And the last option is not to participate at all. So there's really three choices, and it's very preliminary at this point to lean towards one. What we're suggesting is that we kick off almost immediately after the council, assuming the council approves the term sheet, our community outreach process, following the proposal that Dylan has put together for us. And just for everybody who's listening, the Lake Erie Power Connector is a 1,000 megawatt high voltage direct current power cable that will connect Ontario to Pennsylvania. And it involves putting the transmission cable, connecting it from Nanticoke under Lake Erie over to Pennsylvania. There have been many projects like this that have laid electrical systems under lakes in Ontario and Canada. So it's not new technology. In fact, there's hundreds of these types of deployments, but it's new for us, and it's in our backyard, so to speak. And so we've been working with ITC on the project for many months to better understand what the opportunities are, what the risks are, and frankly, to build out an outreach plan for the community so we can educate people on what it really means for them. Maybe I'll stop there, Chief, for a second and see if there's any questions. And I can go in more detail on each of the options if you'd like, or I can talk more high level around what our next steps might be.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Matt, for laying that out. I just want to look to any further questions or comments at this point. I see Michelle has her hand raised.
Thanks. Thanks, Matt. And I'm not sure that community is, we read the materials, but I think it would have been better if we would have showed actually some of the briefing note on the screen. And so for me, I have a couple questions. So if I understand this correctly, you're looking to engage community the first step, right? By us signing the term sheet, that's exactly it. Does the community want to move forward with this?
That's correct. I mean, the goal of the term sheet is to enter into an understanding with ITC so that we can move forward and socialize this opportunity to the community. And if it helps, Michelle, I do have a few slides that we can share to provide sort of an overview of what the project is, so people can better understand it. If you wish, we could show that.
I think that would be good, because as you've seen, we had an hour presentation earlier, and community was engaged. Community wants to know. And as a council, we want to be transparent. So I think it makes a lot of sense to share as much information as you can, and also obtain feedback from community.
Sure.
Yeah, I would agree. Thanks for that, Michelle. So if I can, I know I do recognize Helen and Nathan. If I can just maybe go over to Matt first, just to lay out a quick presentation on more in depth on this project, and then I'll go back to the speaking list and start with Helen, back over to Nathan.
Okay.
Okay, Matt, if I can just pass it back over to you just to walk us through a more in depth on this project.
Yeah, I'll try and share my screen here. I think I can do this here. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So this is just a few slides, just to sort of very high level about the project. So what is the project? As I mentioned earlier, it's a high voltage direct current power line that connects Ontario to Pennsylvania. There are really two parties. The party in Ontario is the IESO, which is the Independent Electricity Systems Operator in Ontario. And for all intents and purposes, they are the customer for the Canadian portion of the project. And then on the other side of the lake, of course, you've got the United States, and there's a US entity down there known as PJM. and they are effectively the counterpart for the Ontario Electrical Systems Operator. And so they would be the customer on the US side. And what happens, it's a bidirectional transmission line, so that when there's periods where Ontario needs power, it will draw power out of the United States, and vice versa. When Ontario has an abundance or extra power, it will and can sell that power into the United States. The thing that's important to consider is that without this asset, there is a tremendous amount of waste in the electrical system. And as we know, the Nanticoke area was a host to a large coal generating station, and there's thousands of megawatts of power capacity on that the Nanticoke transmission corridor that's underutilized. And so rather than have Ontario on the grid go and build new transmission assets to chop down trees somewhere else, we've got this transmission corridor that's underutilized. And this Lake Erie connector is effectively an asset to help monetize the existing infrastructure that we already have, and use it to its highest and best use before we go and build other assets. So that's really one of the real value adds for the power connector for the Ontario systems grid. So on overview, I've sort of just talked about this. It's an AC cable will connect to the grid on the Ontario side. It'll be converted to direct current, and then that high voltage direct current line will connect Nanticoke with Pennsylvania. It's about a 104-kilometer transmission line, about half of which is in Canada and the other half is in the United States. And as I mentioned, it's a very safe and reliable technology. It's been used for decades and almost 200 installations worldwide. So we're not talking about technology here that hasn't been used before. As part of this whole process, ITC has gone through the National Energy Board and a number of agencies in order to get the requisite permits in order to actually construct the line. We are now looking, as part of our due diligence, conducting a review of all of those permits to make sure that they were completed to a high standard. They are, in fact, meeting all of the mitigation measures that were articulated in those studies. And that's really what Negan Burnside, our environmental engineering company, is looking at. So the location of the project, you can see, it's a fairly small footprint, fairly close to the lake. And it's right down here. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not. And it's right beside the old Nanticoke generating station, which everybody knows is now decommissioned. And the plan is to run the line down Haldeman Road 55 into the lake, but it will be a buried line and it will be in the right of way under Haldeman Road 55. It's also important to note that the line itself will not touch the edge of the lake. It's actually directional drilled and emerges out in the lake. But part of our studies through Negan Burnside is to assess impacts on the environment, wildlife, and any other ecological considerations that we might have. So what are the benefits? So ITC engaged independent engineers to assess the economics. One of the main drivers is ratepayer savings, and that affects all the households here in our own community. It's estimated over $100 million of net benefit to the Ontario ratepayers, of which every household in Six Nations as a Hydro One customer is a ratepayer. So there will be ratepayer savings associated with the line. It's not going to show up in perhaps dollars, but maybe in cents somewhere on your hydro bill moving forward. The other thing I think that's important to note is the environmental attributes. Carbon emissions reductions by 2 to 3 million tons a year. And I think that although it's not really mentioned here, I spoke about it earlier, we've got this transmission corridor that's underutilized. And for me, I would rather utilize all of the tools we have in the electrical system before we go as a society building other things. And so I think this is one way we can monetize that existing transmission line. And of course, there's jobs and economic benefits. And as an equity investor or owner of the project, there are considerable revenue streams that will flow to our community, upwards of $45 million over the next 40 years, and potentially a lot more than that. But all of those numbers would be socialized through our community outreach, our investment review with the community, to share what those economics are, what it means for the community. But I think part of the narrative here is really explaining why this is needed. And that's part of the mission of information sharing with the community, so that they understand why it's important, why it's needed, what's the value associated with the environmental aspects, and the value associated with our community. I'll stop sharing here and stop for questions, Chief.
Okay, thanks, Matt, for providing more detail on this project. I know there's lots of questions circulating for those who are community members who are watching online. The first one is, what are the environmental impacts of this? I know you touched a little bit on that piece, and as well, you've also touched on what is the benefits to our community. So I know you've also touched on those pieces, but if you can just maybe reiterating those pieces: one, the environmental impacts, and two, the benefits of this project to our community.
Okay, so I'll start on the benefits to the community, because that's where it's the first order of business on the briefing note. So the benefits to the community are really economics. Of course, we've carved out some commitments from ITC to utilize our employees and contractors where we have the capacity and capability to do so, and that's good. And we typically do that in all of our arrangements. But then there's the two options I mentioned: the equity as an investor into the project and the returns associated with that. As an equity investor, within over the course of 40 years, we can generate a net cash flow, so net profit that would flow to the community of about $45 million over the next 40 years. And this asset lives far beyond 40 years. It could potentially go as high as 90 million, depending on contract negotiations with the province. So that's the equity option if we are an owner. And the interesting thing is, as an equity owner, you own a percentage of the transmission line. So which means at some point in the future, if it gets sold, we would have an ownership stake in that line when it is sold. The other option, as I mentioned earlier, is the royalty option, where we are a recipient of what they call participation payments. It's like rent, essentially. And the participation payments are lower than the equity option. They're expected to range somewhere between 30 and $40 million over the next 40 years, growing to potentially as high as, do you think it was like as high as 55 million over 55 years? But there's no certainty around that. The challenge with the royalty option is if the asset gets sold, we're not a party to the ownership structure, so we wouldn't be a beneficiary of any of the asset sales. And then the last option, as I mentioned, was the choice not to participate. And the choice not to participate means that we forego any of the economic benefits that would flow to the community through equity or through royalty. The other element that's considered in the agreement is something called community benefit payments. And so ITC has committed that in the event that the council proceeds with the project or agrees to be a party to the community benefits agreement, which effectively means that the council will support the project, that there will be an additional revenue stream that will flow to the council in an order of magnitude of about $1 million over the course of the first 3 years during construction. And then once the project is operational at COD, they will pay approximately $120,000 a year for 40 years in consideration for the support that the council will lend to the project. So as I mentioned, the benefits to the community are largely economic. We do have a provision to potentially provide employment and contracting services. It's not a carve out, but it is a commitment. I think it's a bona fide commitment from ITC to utilize our labor force where we have the capacity to do so. And really, for us, it's about how do we clearly lay that out in a way so that we can identify any risks and concerns the community might have, which leads me to your next question, I think, Chief, it was around the environmental considerations, right? And so we do have a comprehensive due diligence process that we've identified. And as I mentioned, there is a legal review where our lawyers have already looked at the term sheet. They've already looked at, our capacity funding arrangements and things of that nature. We've had council's lawyer at Blake's review the Schedule A support terms for the council in the event that there's a community benefit agreement, and they've got no concerns with the language as proposed in the term sheet. And we've done a preliminary financial review, as I mentioned, and those numbers that I had cited to you are from an independent consultant who has evaluated the financial model that was prepared by ITC. So it's not something that was developed by us. It's an independent evaluation. And The environmental piece, as I mentioned, we've retained Negan Burnside, who are an Indigenous environmental consulting firm, and the scope of work for them is to assess the cumulative effects of the development, the fish and wildlife habitat, any impacts of water quality, environmental management, air and noise impacts, any land habitat enhancements, or any cultural or archaeology impacts as well. So Lonnie's group over in the Lands and Resources Department were involved between 2014 and 2018, I think it was, on some of the archaeology work that took place. And so Negan Burnside is engaged with Lonnie's staff. We are, and they are, looking through the archaeology reports to make sure that any mitigation requirements that were identified by that archaeology work are captured and dealt with as part of the development as it moves forward. So that would be my response to the environmental questions. We're looking at it from multiple angles, not just land-based, but habitat-based in the water, in the lake, water quality, noise, and all those other aspects. And then the cumulative effects of all of those things together. What does it mean? And we'll ultimately have a report from Negan Burnside that will clearly articulate any of the mitigation or concerns that we might have and recommendations to mitigate moving forward. I think it's a very, very robust approach for assessing the environmental considerations with the project. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we have retained Dillon Consulting to frame out and lead our community outreach process as an independent body. Historically, the Development Corporation or our staff have taken on that responsibility, and it's challenging. But now with Dillon Consulting, we believe that level of objectivity will stimulate additional conversations that may not have happened in the past, and they will be an objective voice to gather and synthesize the feedback from the community into a report that will help inform the final decision that will be brought back to the council to be made. So just to be clear, the Development Corporation was appointed to sort of be the lead negotiator to advance the project. We are not the decision maker. We are negotiating and putting things in language in a way that's understandable and can be shared with the community in a logical format, so that we can educate the people about what it means. And then ultimately a recommendation will come back to the council from the Development Corporation to either proceed with an equity or a royalty option. But ultimately the decision is the council's to choose between equity, the royalty, or not to participate at all. That's not the Development Corporation's decision to make.
Okay, Matt, thank you. So thank you so much for laying that out so diligently and eloquently. I just want to acknowledge two guests that have joined us, Sherry Brandt and Doug Motley, as part of the delegation. Just wanted to acknowledge you two, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm going to go now to any further questions and comments from council. I do see Nathan has his hand raised. So I'll first begin actually with Helen first. Helen had hers first, and then I'll go over to Nathan, and then we'll go from there. So Helen, you have the floor. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nathan. She's waving you on, I believe. Nathan, you have the floor.
Thanks, Chief, and thanks, Matt, for the presentation. You actually answered my question, but it prompted another question in my head. In terms of the first question around the advantages of using the existing line and enhancing it, I'm wondering if you can illuminate a little bit more on how that's also an advantage to us as owners of the line, that we're not creating new lines, and that environmental impact would be a negative if we were creating a new corridor and a new line, but we're actually just using the existing line and enhancing it going forward as well. And kind of how that will translate into the benefits on the economic side for us. So that was the first question. The second question is, do we have kind of a time frame? Because I went right to Dillon's Consulting, and council knows my love for communications. I went right to their work plan, and I think it's a great work plan in terms of how they've set out the methodology. The only thing I was wondering is what's their time frame to get a lot of that work done? I just want to make sure we're giving enough time for the community to digest the information. We're not just doing one-off kind of workshops and then leave that issue and go on to the next. I just want to make sure we're doing our due diligence to take our time with the community engagement to come up with those decisions.
Okay, I'll just take a shot at that as best I can. So just to be clear, and thanks, Nathan. So just to be clear, the transmission corridor in question is the Nanticoke transmission corridor, and we don't have an ownership position in that. We have an ownership position in the Niagara Reinforcement transmission line. So from an economic standpoint, there isn't a real direct tie to the transmission corridor in Nanticoke. But the way these assets work is really the customer in question is the IESO, and they pay a fee. In this case, they'll pay a fee to the Lake Erie Connector project. And in exchange for that fee, they have the ability to use that transmission line at their discretion. When I spoke about the transmission line that connects the Lake Erie Connector, which is the Nanticoke transmission corridor, that's got thousands of megawatts of idle capacity that's not utilized. And so if I'm the kind of person who always wants to maximize the utility of the things that we already have before we build new things. And so I look at that transmission corridor and I see, Nanticoke, and it's an area where there was already, an industrial presence. That area, in my mind, should be host to lots of types of assets that we can utilize that transmission corridor before the province goes and builds new transmission corridors in other areas. Because as you mentioned, that means other environmental impacts, chopping down trees and things of that nature. So those things are things that we'd like to avoid, obviously, and not doing that and maximizing the utility of the things that we already have and providing a mechanism to distribute power back and forth from another jurisdiction makes a higher and better use of the assets that we do have. So as a wind farm investor, Six Nations, we own a number of wind farms down in that area. There's something that's called curtailment. And effectively what that means is when the wind blows and the wind turbines are turning, sometimes the power that's generated from those wind turbines isn't needed in the power grid. And so you're generating this power and the ratepayers are effectively paying for it. And that's what really has given renewable energy a bad name. Wind farms are producing power. That power is being paid for, but not being utilized or otherwise wasted. And so we need assets to help utilize those electrons in ways that are meaningful. And so the connector project will enable us to take that power, that excess power, and sell it off into Pennsylvania and other users in that direction. And in the times where you're in, there's more demand than supply in Ontario, it gives an avenue to enhance the reliability for Ontario to stabilize the power grid to meet the demands of our citizens here. So there's a multiple bottom line value set associated with the project, not the least of which is it will help create additional values for the wind and renewable energy assets that we have now. And it will, I think, if you fast forward in time, prove out the value of further renewables being added into the province, which means further greenhouse gas reductions, which means further utilization of the existing transmission assets that we already have, and avoiding running gas plants in Ontario, which you may know, gas plants lead to tremendous greenhouse gas production. So there's multiple values of streams there of consideration, Nathan. With respect to Dylan's proposal, I think Nicole is on the phone. Nicole Kahoku, who works for us, is leading up the community outreach process with Dylan. And Nicole, maybe I could just ask you to give us a quick update on your conversations with them. I know you guys have been having extensive meetings, and maybe you can just share what that plan looks like.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I've been in discussions with Dylan. Pending the council approval on the term sheet, we plan to launch community engagement starting March 1st and run it for a 60-day period until the end of April. Because of the COVID situation, we're looking at doing webinar sessions. There'll be probably 1 or 2 sessions every week that they will be hosting. They're planning targeted outreach as well to all the organizations within Six Nations, inviting them to participate in the process or lunch and learns. There is going to be outreach to the HCCC. Yeah, and so we're just passing over project materials to them right now, and they're assisting in the collateral development. And depending on the decision tonight, we will be busy getting into advertising and things like that with Dylan.
So we're actively engaged right now with Dylan in anticipation of launching this by March 1st. And so our teams have been working together as well as ITC, readying ourselves to kick this off. So it won't be a rushed exercise. I can assure you that. It will be a very calm and well planned and well thought out delivery with a message that can really be translated so people can understand what it means for them. And that, I think, is an important piece for us, is to explain some of the things I just talked about. Like, why is it important for this to be part of the Ontario energy system? Why does it matter to utilize the Nanticoke transmission corridor to mitigate further development? I think that all is part of the narrative that we need to share.
Thanks, Matt and Nicole for sharing that. I know that's a key piece, for community is to know what that engagement looks like. So I really appreciate, Nicole, you sharing and shedding some light on that item. And I think at the end of the day too, is what is collected, right, from the engagement obviously is going to play a big role in the decision this council has to make. So that's part of I think in terms of how we further build trust in transparency and accountability is just by doing what we're doing now. Having this first step, being very open to, the intentions of this project with our community, what that looks like. But at the end of the day, it's always, a little bit frustrating, because regardless of which, we know we have governance issues in this community. Unfortunately, a lot of the times we can go and do as much engagement as we want and know all the facts about a specific project. However, at the end of the day, it comes down to, well, we're not supporting it at all just because it's DevCorp or council doing it. So that's where I think we need to also kind of get into, our community, where we can, get to everybody and hear everybody's thoughts on this piece, because that's a really important, they're big projects. And the other piece of this too is, we have to look at own source revenue generation, that there's no more if, ands, or buts. We can't sit and wait for Ontario and Canada to continuously look on how they're going to fund this and fund that. We need to get strategic, and we need to be, ahead of the game and start to work on what those own source revenue, situations look like. And so I really think that is an important piece, Nicole, that you laid out in terms of how we're engaging this community, what that looks like, what it means after the engagement is finished, so that at the end of the day, we have all of these pieces to make a good, well-informed decision. And I think that's the most important piece as we move forward. I see Michelle had her hand raised.
Yes. Okay. So thanks. A couple questions. So first one, Nicole. So it was an RFP process and Dylan was selected. That's correct, right?
We didn't do an RFP process, no.
And how come?
We've been working with Dylan on a few other proposals, so we just contacted them to sole source them.
Thanks for that insight. So I'm just trying to understand, so this is coming to council tonight for their approval on the community consultation, or maybe I shouldn't use that word, but it's my understanding though that you've already signed the mutual confidentiality agreement that's in our briefing note, right? But
that's correct.
Matt, did you not just say you don't have the authority? So it's coming to council, so I'm confused.
We don't have the authority to make a decision for the community, but so the mutual confidentiality agreement, all it does is provides a mechanism so that we can get disclosure of information so that we can run our analysis and due diligence. There's no binding nature to the confidentiality agreement to make a decision one way or the other, but it's critical for us to have access to the key documents in order to run our due diligence. Without those key documents, we couldn't present a meaningful presentation to the community. So we needed to enter into a confidentiality agreement. It's something we do a lot with potential developers. non-disclosure agreement type of structures. So, and we also entered into a capacity funding agreement, which is also in the briefing note, which is the mechanism through which we receive funding from ITC to pay for our independent due diligence, our legal advice, and our financial advice. But that relationship is a relationship that we retain the advice, we pay, and we ultimately recover that expense from ITC as part of their commitment to advance our participation in the project, if the council chooses to do so.
Okay, yeah, and I understand like the council, the community actually has input.
Yeah.
I think they do, because when I look at that piece in the briefing note that says, well, the MC binds disclosure of confidential information for 5 years, to me that would say then we can't disclose to community.
Yeah, but it does go on to say that we're collaborating with ITC to ensure that we get
so
disclosure.
What does sufficient mean, I guess?
Sorry?
What does sufficient information mean?
I can tell you this, we are asking for everything. So we want to see all the key documents, all the financial metrics, all the environmental studies. And I think that where it comes down to the collaboration on disclosure, we do speak with ITC on the extent to which we will disclose information publicly. But for us, we expect to see everything as part of our due diligence process. What gets disclosed publicly may be filtered, but ultimately it's our responsibility to make sure we get to the root cause or the root facts. That's what we do.
Okay, so then my final comment then is, what is our liability, our risks in doing this?
Right now, there's no binding nature for us to sign. Like on the term sheet, there's nothing binding to the term sheet. There's nothing binding to the MCA other than the confidentiality for 5 years. And then there's nothing binding on the capacity funding agreement. So at this point, there is virtually no risk for us to pursue this opportunity with the community. We can go through the entire community investment review process. It can come back to the council. And if the council decides that it doesn't want to participate and chooses not to, they're not bound to do anything. And the costs incurred are costs that are incurred by the Development Corporation in part for our time and the funding provided by ITC.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Matt, for that. I know I have Sherilyn in queue next, but just before then, I think the other piece that what I see would be beneficial is, for some of the questions and comments Michelle has raised is in relation to, what to the average community member, you don't necessarily know, what does the term sheet mean? What does a confidentiality agreement mean? Like there's different steps to a business proposition or business opportunity that is just, that's standard business, right? So I think that might be even beneficial when we talk about community engagement, is looking at to see, like if a type of project like this comes forward at a community, what is the steps that need to be taken in order to get to this point? Once we're at this point, and then we're getting to a community engagement and to council and so forth, then we now are at the next step, so I think that might be beneficial as well, as when we talk about these types of projects, and maybe ACDEV or so forth, can maybe have a community webinar or something to at least, and not on a specific project, but to lay out, the different steps of what it all means of a term sheet, what it means for confidentiality agreements. There's things that obviously we can't share at times unless or until we sign a formal agreement and look to that partnership and what that looks like. So just a note on some of the things in terms of what Michelle has raised. I think that might be beneficial even further when we get into more of these types of projects. Sorry, Matt, did you want to say anything to that?
No, I agree. I think that, part of what we're doing in absence of having, a full rebuild of our community consultation model that I know that we've talked about working with the council to do in the future. The more information that we can shed on these things, the better. And, we can put a slide in the community presentation that we're building right now to explain what the sequencing is and why and what they mean. I think that's, I take it for granted because that's the world I live in all the time. We can definitely do that. But I think ultimately as a community, we need to revisit the whole process. And as I think I mentioned before, the Development Corporation we don't want to be the author of that process. What we want to do is we want to follow that process, and whatever standards that the community dictates, we'll follow. But in the absence of that, we do the best that we can. Right?
Exactly. And I think, even further to that, the other, flip side of the coin is we can't just continue to say no, 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 and deny projects like these types, because then how does that then now work for the benefits of our community moving forward when we talk about own source revenue and all those pieces, right? So I think that's where if we can build upon what you're saying, we can get more support and look to even further, getting the opposition. If there's opposition to a project, well, we want to figure out why they're opposed to it. And if there's anything further that we could assist in making sure that, they have the necessary factual information in order to make an informed decision. Sherry Lynn?
Mark, it's Hazel.
Just a couple things. I won't repeat a lot what everybody said. So tonight we're just deciding to take it out to the community and let the community decide out of the 3 options, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
The primary recommendation is to authorize the chief to sign the term sheet, right? That's the first recommendation. Then the second one is authorize the development corporation to undertake the community investment review as outlined in the Dillon report that's attached to the package.
Right.
And that will come back to us, to the management team at the development corporation. We'll finalize a report that will go to our board and then come to the council for the final decision with all of the input we've received from the community.
Right. And they're paying for everything, the consultation or whatever you want to call it, to the community, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So my other thing is I'm sitting here reading this option. I'm just saying if we go to ownership, my question is, are they going to be giving reports, environmental reports yearly? And also if the ownership is quarterly reports or yearly reports? Because I see as the option 2, we're just going to be just collecting the money. But as an owner, you want to know what's going on. So I guess that's my question is, if that's the decision for equity ownership.
So the difference between the equity ownership and the royalty structure is, as an equity owner, we are an owner of the assets. So the one way to think about it is if it ever gets sold, we would be entitled to our percentage.
No, I'm not asking that. I understand that. I'm not asking that. I understand that. I'm asking, are we going to have environmental reports if we own it, like as an owner, as a yearly? The environment's changing. So are we going to have environment assessments yearly given to us so we know what's going on? And the other question I had is, if we do that one as an owner, are we going to have reports and know what's happening with it? If it's quarterly or yearly, are we going to be in the loop? If that's the decision people say, I'm just asking, is that going to be part of it?
So as an equity investor in all of the things that we've done already as an equity investor, we do get at a minimum quarterly performance reports, financial reports on how the asset is producing. And that's captured in our annual audit, as well as our management discussion and analysis paper that we prepare every year. So there's a scorecard on all of our assets and how they're producing. And that's shared with the community through that document. As it relates to the annual environmental reporting, we have Doug on from ITC. I don't know, Doug, if you have any comments on whether or not that's something that would be included in a reporting package?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for letting me join and listen in. It's a good question, Councillor. I don't know. Maybe Shri understand or remembers what the requirements are. That's certainly something we could talk about, right? And that may be part of the community engagement process and engagement with council is just if that's important, then incorporating that in the agreement, right? It is important to remember too that we're not moving gas or oil. There's nothing to spill, so it's a fairly benign project, but understand things can happen anywhere, right? So understand the concern.
Yeah, and I think the thing I would just quickly add, Sherry Lynn, so there will be monitoring and reporting that is connected to the certificate that the project has from the Canada Energy Regulator. And so whatever those requirements are, certainly they can be shared with partners, and that's a request, and that's something that, if you come in as a limited partner, that's something that can be discussed, and we can make note of that as a takeaway. But there'll be, I would think the obvious piece is to have the same type of reporting that we're sending into the other regulators, and would be happy to share information on it as needed.
Thanks for that, Doug and Sherry, for your responses on that question. I'm going to go over to now. Hazel had her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question in regards to the part where Matt said that Ontario can draw from the Pennsylvania line, and we can draw from them as needed. How do they regulate the cost with a difference in funding for each country? Does Ontario have to pay more when they draw from Pennsylvania?
Honestly, I don't know. I will say that our customer is the IESO, and so they pay us an annual fee, which is like a standby fee, and then they manage the line. So I don't know, Doug or Sheree, if you want to comment on the cost structure of what they would pay.
Sure. I mean, there has been a lot of, it's a good question. There has been a lot of study on economic benefits of the line, and that is one of the benefits, right? Is Ontario has done many procurements of wind and gas and nuclear power and so forth, and there's quite a bit of renewable non-emitting power to the south, right? So it's generally priced very competitively. It is a competitive market though, so you can't control it, but you do know that you're getting the best price you can, and frankly that's one of the benefits of Ontario, is to have access to a competitive market rather than just having to contract for things that there's a limited number of parties that can participate in. Did that answer your question, or was that helpful at all?
Yeah, sort of.
Well, I was just going to add, if I can quickly, I think the point that Matt's raising too is key, right? The project itself will have what's called an availability payment. So a fixed payment, an annual payment. So the project has cost certainty in terms of its revenues. And then the risk is really back on to the province, ISO, who is in the business of energy regulation and trading and all of that on a day-to-day basis, to go and maximize its original purchase price and defray that cost by selling power into the other markets and reducing some of its losses. So maybe that helps too.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those responses as well. Is there any further questions or comments? Okay, seeing or hearing none, then there is recommendations on the agenda. So the first one, which has been laid out in terms of the term sheet to further authorize myself to sign that. The second one is in relation to the undertake a community investment review process as further captured in the Dillon Consulting proposal commencing March 1st and concluding on April 30th. And the third one is for second reading to be waived. So I'm looking at this point in time, if there's no further questions or comments on recommendation 4D1. Is there a mover or seconder to that effect? Moved by Helen. Seconder?
I'll second Margaret's Hazel.
Second by Hazel. I'll now look to any further questions or comments in relation to the motion. Okay, seeing or hearing none, then I will go to a vote. All in favor?
In favor.
Any opposed?
I do. And can I have that recorded?
Okay, one is opposed. Michelle Bombery would like her name recorded as opposition. The motion is carried. I'm going to move now to the second recommendation, 4D2. Is there a mover and seconder to that effect? Moved by Helen. Seconder?
I'll second it, Melba.
Second by Melba. Are there any further questions or comments in relation to that motion? Okay, seeing or hearing none then, all in favor?
Favor.
Any opposed?
Me.
One opposed, Michelle Bobbery, Councillor Michelle. Motion is carried. I'll now look to the third recommendation, which is second reading to be waived. Looking to a mover and seconder to that effect. Moved by Helen, seconder.
I'll second Hazel.
I'll second it, Melba.
I'll go with Hazel, seconded by Hazel. Thanks, Melba. Are there any further questions or comments in relation to second reading? Seeing or hearing none, all in favor? Any opposed? One opposed, Michelle Bombery. Motion is carried. Okay, Matt and Doug and Sherry, Nicole, all those on the line, thank you for joining us this evening. Just want to check in with Matt. Is there anything further on your end?
No, I appreciate the time. Thanks, Council.
Thanks,
well,
everybody.
thank you so much. I hope you all stay safe. Take care. Nice
Take
to see
care.
you.
Yeah, and
Take care.